270,000 acres. That's how much land one man quietly assembled in California while drawing a federal salary to protect Native Americans, on the very same land he was buying for himself. Edward Fitzgerald Beale, war hero, gold rush messenger, friend of presidents, built the largest private landholding in the state, an empire the size of metropolitan Los Angeles. He grazed 125,000 sheep on it. He kept camels on it. And when he died, his family sold it to the most powerful newspaper baron in the West, who nearly lost it all within 4 years. That ranch still exists. It's a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. And after more than 180 years, the people who own it still cannot figure out what to do with it. The gates are padlocked. They've been padlocked for generations. If you've driven Interstate 5 between Los Angeles and Bakersfield, and if you live in California, you probably have, you've passed through Tejon Ranch without realizing it. 16 miles of highway cut through the property. 89,000 vehicles a day roll across land that belongs to a single company. The hills on either side, golden brown in summer, green after the rains, belong to them. The canyons, the oak groves, the ridges where condors circle, all of it behind fences and locked gates and no trespassing signs. You might notice the outlets at Tejon, or the truck stop where long-haul drivers refuel, but the land stretching beyond them in every direction, 422 square miles of California, is territory that most Californians have never set foot on and never will. And the story of how it got that way involves gold samples smuggled across Mexico in a saddlebag, a failed experiment with imported camels, one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded in the United States, the publisher of the Los Angeles Times, a bankruptcy that was saved by finding oil, a $26 million art installation made of 1,760 giant yellow umbrellas, and a tribe of Native Americans who were pushed off this land 170 years ago and just opened a $600 million casino next door. It starts with a dead badger. In the early 1800s, a Spanish lieutenant named Francisco Ruiz led soldiers through a canyon in the Tehachapi Mountains, where the southern San Joaquin Valley meets the transverse ranges. At the mouth of the canyon, they found a dead badger. Ruiz named the place El Tejon, Spanish for badger. He named the canyon Cañada de las Uvas, Grapevine Canyon, for the wild grapevines growing everywhere. And then the Spanish moved on, because in those years California was still the far edge of empire, too remote and too wild for anyone to do much with. The Chumash, the Yokut, the Kawaiisu, and the Kitanamuk had lived on this land for centuries. Their mortar rocks and drawn images are still there, carved into stone that predates every legal claim anyone would ever file on this property. Between 1843 and 1846, the Mexican government, trying to colonize its California frontier, issued land grants to Mexican citizens. 4 grants in particular, Rancho El Tejon, Rancho de Castac, Rancho La Liebre, and Rancho Los Alamos y Agua Caliente, covered a combined territory of nearly 200,000 acres. These grants were designed to spur settlement and economic activity. They were also the foundation of something their creators never imagined, the largest contiguous piece of private property California would ever see. But the man who would assemble those grants into one empire wasn't Mexican. He was a 24-year-old Navy lieutenant from Washington, D.C., named Edward Fitzgerald Beale. And in 1846, he was doing something far more dangerous than ranching. He was sneaking past enemy lines in the middle of a war. The Mexican-American War brought Beale to California, and the Battle of San Pascual made him famous. 30 miles north of San Diego in December 1846, American forces under General Stephen Kearny were surrounded by Mexican lancers. Casualties were mounting. Supplies were gone. If reinforcements didn't arrive from Commodore Stockton's forces near San Diego, the entire command faced annihilation. Beale and Kit Carson, who would remain friends for decades, volunteered for what amounted to a suicide mission. Slip through 4 Mexican defense lines in the dark, cross 30 miles of rocky desert, and bring back help. They removed their shoes to move silently. They crawled on their bellies through cactus and sand, past sentries close enough to hear breathing. At some point, both men lost their shoes entirely and completed the march barefoot over stones and thorns. They made it. Stockton dispatched reinforcements. The siege was broken. Beale was so physically destroyed by the ordeal, dehydrated, lacerated, weakened by dysentery he'd already been fighting, that it took him months to recover. He was 24 years old. And he came out of that war with a reputation that would open every door in Washington for the next 50 years. And then he did something that would, in a very real sense, create modern California. In the summer of 1848, gold had been discovered at Sutter's Mill. The news was confined to California. The Army and the Navy both recognized the magnitude of what had happened, and both wanted to be first to carry the confirmation to Washington. A quiet, high-stakes race began. The Navy chose Beale. In late July, carrying official dispatches from the consul at Monterey and a leather pouch containing actual gold samples, he departed from La Paz on the Baja Peninsula. The route was insane. Mexico was still, in practical terms, hostile territory for an American military officer. Beale crossed the country in disguise, dodging detection, traveling by mule and on foot through terrain he didn't know. He reached the Gulf Coast, boarded a ship to Mobile, Alabama, and then made his way overland to the capital. He arrived in Washington on a muggy Saturday evening, September 16, 1848. He was 26 years old, sun-browned and gaunt. He met President James Polk. He showed him the gold. The dispatches confirmed what the rumors had whispered. California's rivers were running with it. The Army's courier, traveling the supposedly safer route by way of Panama, didn't reach Washington until November, 2 full months behind. Beale had won the race. His 47-day journey became front-page news. The gold samples became proof. And the news he carried triggered the largest voluntary migration in American history. Within a year, tens of thousands of people were flooding into California from every direction. A territory became a state. San Francisco exploded from a village into a city. And Beale, the man who'd lit the fuse, was now one of the most famous young men in America. 5 presidential appointments would follow. 5 different presidents found a use for Edward Beale. Millard Fillmore made him superintendent of Indian Affairs for California and Nevada. James Buchanan sent him to survey a wagon road across the Southwest. Abraham Lincoln made him Surveyor General of California. Ulysses Grant appointed him ambassador to Austria-Hungary. But it was that first civilian appointment, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, that planted the seed of everything that followed. And it's also where the story gets uncomfortable. In 1853, Beale established the Sebastian Indian Reservation, the first Indian reservation in California. He named it after Senator William K. Sebastian of Arkansas, who chaired the Indian Affairs Committee and backed Beale's plans. The reservation covered about 75,000 acres of land in the Tejon region, prime valley and canyon land where the Tehachapis meet the San Joaquin. Beale put displaced Native Americans to work farming it. He brought in cattle, sheep, farm equipment, and white employees to supervise. By 1854, he reported 2,500 Indians living on the reservation with over 2,000 acres under cultivation. Congress had appropriated $250,000 to improve conditions under Beale's watch. The reservation, by most accounts, was one of the more functional ones in the state. Here's the problem. The reservation sat on privately held land that belonged to the holders of the Mexican grants. Beale had mapped and established the reservation on property he knew the federal government didn't own, hoping Congress would eventually buy it. But then Beale left his government post. And then Beale began buying the land himself. Between 1855 and 1866, he purchased all 4 Mexican land grants. Rancho La Libre first in 1855, then Rancho El Tejon and Rancho Los Alamos y Agua Caliente in 1865 after the Army abandoned Fort Tejon. Finally, Rancho de Castac in 1866. Total holdings, roughly 270,000 acres. The man who had been paid by the federal government to protect Native Americans on this land was now its private owner. The Indians who'd been farming it under federal supervision found themselves living on someone else's property. Some researchers have alleged that Beale used federal money and federal improvements to enhance land he then took title to privately, becoming a multimillionaire in the process. The Tejon Indians lost claim to their traditional holdings. They would not regain federal recognition until 2012, more than 150 years later. Hold that thought. Fort Tejon, meanwhile, had its own strange chapter before Beale ever owned the land beneath it. Established by the Army in 1854 to protect both the reservation and white settlers from desert raids, the fort grew into the third largest settlement in Southern California, a genuine community of soldiers, families, blacksmiths, and Native American laborers perched in a mountain canyon that most maps didn't even bother to label. The Butterfield Overland Mail ran stagecoaches through it starting in 1858. It was remote, but it was real. And on the morning of January 9th, 1857, it became the epicenter of catastrophe. At roughly 8:20 a.m., a magnitude 7.9 earthquake ripped along the San Andreas Fault for over 220 miles, from Parkfield to Wrightwood. The shaking lasted between 1 and 3 minutes. Captain John W.T. Gardner, the fort's commanding officer, later wrote that he was thrown from his bed across the floor of his quarters and could not get to his feet because of the violence of the motion. Rivers reportedly flowed backward. Lake waters surged onto their shores, stranding fish miles from original lake beds. The ground itself ruptured with an average displacement of 15 feet and a maximum offset of nearly 30 feet in the Carrizo Plain, where the fault tore the earth open like a wound that hasn't fully healed to this day. It was one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the United States. Only 2 people died, a woman crushed by a collapsing adobe house near the fort, and an elderly man who collapsed in a plaza in Los Angeles. And the only reason the toll wasn't catastrophic is that California in 1857 was nearly empty. Fort Tejon sat at the junction of the San Andreas and Garlock faults, right where 3 mountain ranges collide and tectonic plates grind against each other with forces that geologists still describe as overdue for release. The land Beale was assembling into a ranch empire sat on one of the most seismically violent spots on the continent. He bought it anyway. Then came the Camels. This is not folklore, this is documented federal policy. In 1855, Congress appropriated $30,000 to import camels for use as military pack animals in the arid Southwest. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, the same Jefferson Davis who would later lead the Confederacy, championed the idea. By 1857, Beale was leading a caravan of 25 camels from Texas to California, surveying a wagon road along the 35th parallel. The expedition lasted nearly 4 months and covered 1,200 miles. The camels performed remarkably well. They could carry heavier loads than mules. When the expedition reached the Colorado River, Beale was told camels couldn't swim. The largest camel was led to the water, plunged in fully loaded, and swam across without hesitation. The rest followed. 2 horses and 10 mules drowned making the same crossing, but the camels spooked every horse they came near, and nobody could find enough experienced American handlers. The military eventually gave up. When the Army auctioned its surplus camels, some went to a circus, which later went bankrupt and released them into the desert near Fort Yuma, leading to years of confused reports about camels wandering the Arizona wilderness. Beale bought several himself. For years, he could be seen riding camels around his ranch. Visitors to Tejon in the 1860s and 1870s would have encountered a former Navy lieutenant former superintendent of Indian Affairs, future ambassador, trotting through the California hills on a camel. The wagon road he surveyed became something larger than anyone anticipated. Portions of Beale's road would later become the route of the Santa Fe Railroad, then Route 66, then Interstate 40. The man who triggered the gold rush also blazed the trail that connected the American West. By 1880, Beale had settled into the ranching life. He'd shifted from sheep to cattle. At the peak, more than 125,000 sheep had grazed his hills, making Tejon one of the largest sheep operations in the West. Journalist Charles Nordhoff visited around this time and called it the most impressive ranch in all of California. But Beale was never just a rancher. In 1872, he bought Decatur House in Washington, D.C., a mansion directly across Lafayette Square from the White House that had served as the residence of several secretaries of state. Beale paid $60,000 for it, renovated it extensively, and turned it into the capital's most famous salon. Kit Carson had been a friend since the desert crawl at San Pasqual. Buffalo Bill Cody visited. President Grant was a regular. He gave Beale his final adventure in 1876, appointing him ambassador to Austria-Hungary, where Beale reportedly charmed Emperor Franz Joseph I with tales of camels, Indians, and gold dust. He served about a year, then came home and retired. He split his remaining years between the ranch and Decatur House, a man who had lived in both the wildest corners of the frontier and the most refined parlors of the capital, equally at home in each. He died at Decatur House on April 22, 1893, at the age of 71, and was buried in Chester, Pennsylvania. The ranch passed to his son, Truxton. And Truxton Beale didn't want it. Not immediately, anyway. He had his own career as a diplomat and viewed the ranch differently than his father had. Edward Beale had walked every canyon, surveyed every ridge, grazed livestock on land he'd first seen through the eyes of a federal official. Truxton saw a balance sheet. He held the ranch for about 2 decades, donated a 64-foot clock tower to Bakersfield in memory of his mother, funded the Beale Memorial Library in Kern County, and generally behaved like a man who viewed the property as an inheritance to be managed, not a passion to be pursued. By 1911, he was ready to sell. The buyers who appeared were not casual ranchers. They were the most powerful land speculators in Southern California. Harry Chandler, publisher of the Los Angeles Times, was arguably the most powerful man in Southern California. He and his father-in-law, Harrison Gray Otis, had used the Times as a weapon and a megaphone, promoting the Owens Valley Aqueduct that made modern Los Angeles possible, while simultaneously buying up San Fernando Valley land that the aqueduct's water would make enormously valuable. When the water arrived in 1913, Valley property values jumped from under $100 an acre to thousands. Chandler's syndicate had purchased 47,500 acres of that valley at $53 per acre. He helped build the Hollywood Bowl and the Biltmore Hotel. He understood that in Southern California, land was the only game that mattered, and owning the newspaper meant you could promote your own investments while calling it news. Moses Sherman, his partner, was a streetcar magnate and land developer who had served on the very water board that approved the aqueduct, a conflict of interest so brazen it would be illegal today. Together with Hobart J. Whitley, Otto Brandt, and roughly 65 other investors, they formed a syndicate and offered Truxton Beale $3 million for the ranch, half in cash, $1.5 million, and half carried as a mortgage payable in 1 year. The deal closed in 1912. To understand what $3 million meant in 1912, Chandler's group had bought 47,500 acres of the San Fernando Valley for $2.5 million just a few years earlier. The Tejon Ranch was nearly 6 times that size, and they got it for only slightly more. Chandler saw the ranch the way he saw everything, as land waiting to become valuable. His group secured water entitlements, shifted operations to cattle ranching and irrigated farming, and even tried raising ostriches because ostrich plumes were fashionable and the profit margins looked extraordinary. The ostriches proved ornery. The fashion passed. The plumes became worthless. Within 4 years, the entire investment was in trouble. By 1916, neither cattle nor farming was generating the returns the syndicate had projected. Worse, many of the 70 investors had failed to pay their $25,000 promissory notes. The group couldn't cover its mortgage. Foreclosure loomed. Chandler and Sherman stepped in to save it. The Times-Mirror Corporation took half the mortgage, Sherman took the other half. But the underlying problem never went away. The ranch made money slowly, unpredictably, and never enough to justify the scale of the investment. Sherman eventually sold most of his share to banks and insurance companies. The land was too vast, too remote, and too difficult to monetize. It was a fortune you could see on a map, but couldn't deposit in a bank. Then came 1936, and the ranch nearly died. The Pacific Mutual Life Insurance Company and Security First National Bank of Los Angeles, holders of the outstanding debt, demanded foreclosure. After years of lackluster performance, defaults, and a depression that crushed agricultural prices nationwide, they'd had enough. What followed was a financial restructuring that saved the property by fundamentally transforming what it was. On February 14, 1936, the Tejon Ranch Company was incorporated as a California corporation, and 108,000 shares of stock were issued. The unwieldy syndicate of 70 individual investors, some dead, some disinterested, some bankrupt themselves, became a single corporate entity with a board of directors and a fiduciary obligation to make the land pay. The debt was refinanced. The Chandler family, through Times-Mirror, retained a controlling interest. The ranch had survived, but it was no longer anyone's private kingdom. It was a business. And then something happened underground that changed everything. Oil was discovered on ranch land. The timing was almost miraculous. Just as the company was reorganizing after near foreclosure, petroleum revenues began flowing. Oil royalties became the financial shock absorber that kept the ranch solvent through the 1940s and 1950s, decades when cattle and farming alone couldn't have sustained a property this size. The ranch survived not because ranching worked, but because something buried beneath the grass was worth more than anything growing on top of it. For the next several decades, Tejon Ranch settled into a quiet rhythm that concealed its extraordinary scale. Cattle grazed 250,000 acres. Almonds, pistachios, wine grapes, and walnuts grew in irrigated orchards. Oil wells pumped. A cement operation was leased to the National Cement Company of California. Rock and aggregate were quarried. Hunters paid for guided trips through the backcountry, pursuing deer, elk, wild pigs, and upland birds across terrain that looked essentially unchanged since the Yokut and Chumash had hunted it centuries before. Film crews rented landscapes for commercials, television shows, and movies. The ranch's remoteness and visual range made it a natural back lot. The company even ran a quarter-horse breeding program. Every one of these activities made some money. None of them made enough money to justify the sheer overhead of managing 422 square miles. But combined, they kept the ranch alive. In 1973, the company went public on the American Stock Exchange. The Chandler heirs still controlled it. In 1986, the board approved a 10-for-1 stock split. The padlocked gates stayed locked. In 1995, storms wiped out 23% of the almond orchards, a reminder that farming on this scale meant exposure to risk on this scale. Then, in October 1991, the most improbable thing happened on this remote cattle ranch. Nearly 2,000 enormous yellow umbrellas appeared on the hillsides. The artists Christo and Jean-Claude, who had spent years wrapping bridges and buildings around the world, the Pont Neuf in Paris, later the Reichstag in Berlin, chose the amber hills of Tejon Ranch for one half of an international art installation called The Umbrellas. The other half, 1,340 blue umbrellas, went up simultaneously in the rice paddies of Ibaraki, Japan. On Tejon land, 1,760 yellow umbrellas, each nearly 20 feet tall and weighing 448 pounds, were erected along a 19-mile stretch of Interstate 5. The color yellow was chosen deliberately to complement the golden-brown grasslands of the ranch. The project had been in planning since 1987. The artists had to secure permits from federal, state, and local governments, plus 23 private landowners. A team of 1,880 people erected the umbrellas. Some had to be helicoptered to hilltops because no road could reach them. The whole thing cost $26 million, entirely self-financed by the artists through sales of their earlier work. And this was a working cattle ranch. Christo's crew famously left a gate open between a herd of cows and a herd of bulls that weren't supposed to mix that time of year, provoking an emergency meeting with ranch management. For 18 days, beginning October 9, 1991, roughly 3 million people came to see them. Families had picnics under the giant umbrellas. Drivers on I-5 slowed to stare at hillsides that had looked the same for a century, suddenly transformed into something that made no sense and perfect sense at the same time. Aline Zanger, a senior executive at Tejon Ranch who had worked with Christo and Jean-Claude since the planning began, later described the opening morning. The umbrellas unfurling in the first sunlight, the yellow fabric catching the dawn. She called it one of the most exciting moments of her life. But the excitement didn't last. On October 27th, a sudden wind caught one of the California umbrellas and tore it loose. It crushed a woman. Christo immediately ordered the entire exhibition closed and dismantled. A worker was also killed during the deconstruction of the Japanese installation. The land was restored to its original condition. The umbrellas vanished. The hills returned to brown and gold and silence. By the mid-1990s, the company's leadership recognized what every owner since Beale had eventually confronted. The land along Interstate 5 was potentially worth far more as developed real estate than as rangeland. In 1997, the Chandler's Times Mirror Company sold its controlling stake. The dynasty that had held the ranch for 85 years walked away. The company began announcing ambitious development plans. In 1999, the Petro Travel Plaza opened. Gas stations, fast food, a truck stop. The first commercial development on ranch land. That same year, Tejon Ranch moved to the New York Stock Exchange. The stock symbol was TRC. Revenue hit $55.9 million, an all-time high. The company had 45,000 head of cattle, nearly 2,000 acres of almonds, 1,500 acres of wine grapes, and a vision for something much larger. The vision was called Centennial. First proposed in 1999, it would build 19,333 homes on about 12,000 acres at the northern edge of Los Angeles County. A master-planned community for roughly 57,000 people, complete with schools, fire stations, a police station, a library, and 10 million square feet of commercial space. On paper, it was the answer to California's housing crisis. In practice, it triggered one of the longest environmental battles in Southern California history. The problem was straightforward, and it was insoluble. The proposed site sat 65 miles from downtown Los Angeles, in some of the last native grassland in the state, habitat for San Joaquin kit foxes, mountain lions, Thule elk, and California condors. Rail service to the area was cost prohibitive. Every one of the community's projected 57,000 residents would need a car. The greenhouse gas emissions from all those commutes, each one roughly 130 miles round trip to any major employment center, would contradict California's climate commitments. Environmental groups mounted a multi-front assault. The Center for Biological Diversity argued the project would destroy irreplaceable habitat. The California Native Plant Society said it would pave over one of the state's last significant stands of native wildflowers. Climate Resolve challenged the greenhouse gas analysis. Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, the lone dissenter on the board, warned of fire risk and expressed skepticism about the developer's promises on jobs and affordable housing. The L.A. County Board of Supervisors approved the project anyway in 2019 on a 4-to-1 vote. Weeks later, lawsuits were filed. In January 2022, a judge rescinded certain project approvals, finding that the environmental impact report had failed to adequately address greenhouse gas emissions and off-site wildfire risks. A settlement with Climate Resolve yielded extraordinary concessions. All 19,333 homes would be zero emission, with no natural gas hookups, solar panels on every roof, and nearly 30,000 electric vehicle charging stations. But the other two groups refused to settle. In March 2023, the judge ordered the county to set aside its environmental impact certification entirely. The company appealed. In June 2025, the Court of Appeal affirmed the lower court's judgment, ruling that the company had prevailed on 20 of 23 contested issues, but that the 3 remaining deficiencies had to be corrected before construction could begin. In December 2025, the L.A. County Board of Supervisors formally vacated its own approval. The company began the re-entitlement process from scratch. 26 years after Centennial was proposed, not a single home has been built. But here's where the story takes a turn that Beale himself might have appreciated, or dreaded. In 2008, after 20 months of on and off negotiations that culminated in a marathon 3-day bargaining session in April, Tejon Ranch struck a deal with 5 of the country's major environmental organizations: Audubon, California, the Endangered Habitats League, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Planning and Conservation League, and the Sierra Club. The Conservation and Land Use Agreement permanently protected up to 240,000 acres, roughly 90% of the entire ranch, through phased conservation easements. No development ever on those acres. A newly created nonprofit, the Tejon Ranch Conservancy, would manage the conserved land to preserve oak woodlands, native grasslands, and critical habitat for species including the California condor. In exchange, the environmental groups agreed not to oppose development on the remaining 30,000 acres. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger traveled to the ranch in May to celebrate the announcement. It was the largest conservation and land use pact in California history, and it cost taxpayers nothing. Think about what that means. The company that owns 270,000 acres can develop about 30,000 of them, and of those 30,000, the signature project, Centennial, has been blocked by courts for a quarter century. The Tejon Ranch Commerce Center, an industrial park along I-5, is 100% leased. The Outlets at Tejon, a shopping center, operates in a joint venture. A 228-unit apartment complex called Terra Vista opened in 2025. But the big swing, the city-sized development that would have transformed the company's balance sheet, remains a legal impossibility for now. The ranch is worth a fortune. The ranch barely makes money. This has been true for 180 years. And now, remember the Tejon Indians, the people Beale displaced when he established the Sebastian Reservation on their land, then bought that land out from under them. The tribe that was pushed to the Tule River Reservation in the 1860s, scattered, stripped of recognition, erased from official records for over a century. In 2012, the Tejon Indian tribe regained federal recognition, a process that required decades of advocacy, legal work, and political organizing. And then they did something remarkable. On November 13, 2025, the Hard Rock Casino Tejon opened on Tejon Indian tribal land, less than 15 miles south of Bakersfield, at the base of the same Grapevine Mountain Pass where Beale's sheep once grazed and his camels once roamed. The $600 million project, the largest private hospitality investment in Kern County history, features 2,500 slot machines, 50 table games, and a 150,000 square foot gaming floor. It created more than 1,000 permanent jobs. The tribe that lost everything now operates an enterprise worth more than everything Tejon Ranch Company earned in a decade. Chairman Octavio Escobedo III leads a tribe of 1,500 citizens. Most live in Kern County. Many are lifelong residents of Bakersfield. The casino sits on land that, in the broadest sweep of history, was once part of the same territory Beale controlled. The Tejon Ranch Company and the Tejon Indian Tribe are not the same entity. The company is a publicly traded corporation. The tribe is a sovereign nation. But their histories are knotted together in ways that neither fully controls. The tribe's casino opened in the same month that the company's Centennial project was being vacated by the county board. One entity, born from displacement, is building. The other, born from that same displacement, is stalled. The ranch itself remains what it has always been: too large to ignore, too complicated to develop, too valuable to sell, and too unprofitable to justify on paper. It earns revenue from 5 segments now: farming, commercial real estate, mineral resources, ranch operations, and multifamily housing. Total revenue in 2025 was about $49 million. For a company sitting on 270,000 acres in California, with 16 miles of frontage on the state's most trafficked highway, that number is almost comically modest. The stock trades on the NYSE. Institutional investors, Vanguard, BlackRock, Dimensional Fund Advisors hold shares. The company does not pay a dividend. And yet someone drives past those padlocked gates every second of every day. The hills catch the same light they caught when Spanish soldiers found a dead badger and gave the canyon a name. The San Andreas Fault still runs beneath the property, still accumulating stress. The fault hasn't released the energy of an 1857 scale rupture in over 160 years, and the next time it does, the landscape won't be empty rangeland. It will be a corridor lined with warehouses, outlet malls, truck stops, apartment complexes, and possibly, if the approvals ever come through, a city of 57,000 people. Edward Beale bought this land because he knew it before anyone else did. He'd walked it as an Indian Affairs superintendent. He'd surveyed it for wagon roads. He'd grazed camels on it. He understood its position, the place where Northern California and Southern California meet, where the mountains part and the valley opens, where every road and railroad and highway would eventually have to pass. That geography hasn't changed. The I-5 corridor that carries 89,000 vehicles a day is the same gap in the mountains that Jedediah Smith walked through, that Kit Carson rode through, that Beale marched his camels through. The land's value has always been obvious. What to do with it has never been. Abraham Lincoln signed the federal deed that converted the Mexican land grants into American property titles. Beale's family donated that document to the Autry Museum of the American West in 2018. Lincoln's signature, formalizing the transfer of 250,000 acres from Mexican rancheros to an American adventurer who parlayed war heroism, government appointments, gold samples in a saddlebag, and a spectacular conflict of interest into the largest private estate in California. The Cross and Crescent brand, the ranch's cattle brand, transferred to the Chandler syndicate in 1917, still serves as the company's logo. Cattle still graze, almonds still grow, oil still pumps, and the gates are still locked. Not because the ranch is hiding anything exactly, but because that is what Tejon Ranch has always done. It sits there, vast and quiet and almost incomprehensibly large, behind its fences, while California builds and sprawls and burns and shakes all around it. The biggest piece of private land in the state, the oldest working ranch in California, a monument to the peculiar American faith that if you can just hold on to enough land long enough, something extraordinary will eventually happen to it. Nothing has, not yet. The hills are still golden, the condors still circle, the padlocks hold.